This is Lifeworlds, the place where we explore life through other eyes and minds. Let's flip the script and discover how to orient your world around nature. I'm Alexa Firminish. Come join me as we get down and forage for fungi, stalk coyotes, draft laws for rivers, hum with beehives, sing bird language, and help beavers to dam again. Let these stories spark your reconnection to nature's multiverse. Learn how to bring ecosystems back to life, become an agent for other intelligences, and begin to see how you too are the sum of all life worlds. Hi, folks. You might know by now that on this podcast, we're in service of elevating the many voices that share planet Earth with us, the humans. We've heard from rewilded honeybees and Chicago inner city coyotes. We've heard from fungi inhabiting the deserts of Latin America to beavers repopulating England's waterways, whales that turn around ocean tankers, and goats that detect volcanic eruptions with the twitch of an ear. Not to mention ancient sequoias, their inner breaths rendered into virtual reality, or vine plants that exhibit astounding signs of memory, and even rivers that have legal personhood, along with insects that thrum to 7-year metronomes and saxophones, and so much more. And if there was to be one common thread, one central figure binding all of these stunning displays of life together, the brush itself of nature's creativity, one could say, it could very well be the element of carbon. The carbon that lives on in your breath, your DNA, in all the soils, in the minerals of the earth, very much the Lego of the planet that brings all of life together. And today's guest, Paul Hawken, is a renowned environmentalist, author, and activist whose work focuses on regeneration, climate solutions, and the redesign of economic systems. And Paul has recently published a book precisely about carbon, and it's called Carbon, the Book of Life. And in it, he does justice to the miracle that is this element that thrums across and within all we see. As I wrote to him on email, I find that his book reads like a love letter, and it's really a riveting journey told through the voice of carbon itself. And Paul takes us very much into its life world. And in doing so, he restores carbon's dignity as a dynamic force that has been building, breaking, and rebirthing the planet for billions of years. Versus, I think, what carbon is being painted as today, which is very much a villain or a culprit of the climate crisis. For example, just an excerpt from the book, he writes, "When discussing carbon, people refer to atoms instead of magnificence. Yet carbon provides the structural framework for trees, cells, shells, hormones, organelles, eyelashes, bones, and bat wings. It is the engineer and maker, a molecular agent animating every trace of life. It shimmers in the cornea of a cheetah's eye. It is the bard of the mitochondrial battery that releases starlight into our bloodstream. The most socially adept entrepreneur in the pantheon of life." Now, this all reflects a worldview that Paul has been advocating for decades, that we must shift from a reductionist, alienating discourse on climate and carbon to one of profound interconnection and relationality. His gift across all of these years of speaking and writing has been to remind us that we are part and parcel of the living world, that there is no quote-unquote climate crisis, but a crisis of human thinking and behavior. And so at the beginning of this episode, we dig into some of the dysfunctional language used when we converse about the global challenges that we face. Problems in using war metaphors, such as fighting or battling. And it's interesting, right? Much of our modern language around nature still carries this residue of control, right? We manage ecosystems, we extract resources, we offset emissions. And today, carbon is cast as something to capture, eliminate, bring down to zero. Whereas Paul reminds us that it is in fact a vibrant agent of renewal. As he says, we talk about decarbonization, but we actually need to recarbonize. Carbon is our ally. And, you know, what's been interesting to me is to follow the evolution of Paul's writing. You may have crossed some of his work, such as The Ecology of Commerce, which was published in 93 and served very much as a foundational text in sustainable business thinking, along with his book Natural Capitalism, which rethinks capitalism itself. And then his 2017 book Drawdown mapped and ranked the most substantive solutions to climate change. And it was pretty groundbreaking. It gave many people I knew a very tangible map for taking action. And then one of his latest works, I actually have it right here for those of you watching on YouTube. It's this wonderful book. And just like Drawdown, it has, you know, dozens and dozens of solutions of planetary regeneration. And, you know, I found that this was a very place-based healing approach to climate work, and it centers justice, biodiversity, indigenous knowledge. And then his latest book, Carbon, which we'll be talking about today, which is as much science as it is spirit, and sings us back into relationship with the animate forces of the earth. So I was intrigued to speak with Paul about the evolution of his work, his sensitivities to communication and language, and what it might have felt like to embody the narrator of Carbon and to let his voice speak through him. I find that this is a very beautiful conversation, and especially near the end, where we touch on the complexity surrounding grief and love. He shares the ecological metaphor of fire-triggered succession, where long dormant seeds can bloom after fire. And we talk about how we can hold everything that's happening on Earth bravely within us at this point in time. Last point for me, I would say that the central spiritual thread here is about coming home, and we talk about it. It's coming home to Earth, to relationality, to meaning. As Paul has said, the way that we heal a system is to connect more of the system to itself. Within and around us is a living, breathing sphere of consciousness woven by a billion years of evolving life. Sentience is underfoot, in the canopy, in the favelas, in the breath of a child, in the intricate, masterful web of life beneath, above, and around us. And so, as always, I hope you will enjoy and gain some benefit from these conversations. Paul, I am so delighted to have you here on LifeWorld. This has been following such a rich exchange by email of ideas and, you know, musings about the world, and I'm delighted. This is actually our first face-to-face conversation. So thank you for coming on the show, and the timing is perfect right after the release of your book, which we're going to speak to in just a little while. But first, wanting to say good morning, enjoying your green tea in the lands of, I believe, somewhere on the west coast of the United States.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's so lovely to meet you. I feel like our lives have been intertwined through words and through my listening to Life Worlds as well, which I listen to a lot of podcasts, but there's few that I listen to more than once of the same episode. And yours I've listened to like one episode 3 different times. And so I feel like we have a relationship, which is sort of oblique and indirect, but it has had such a big influence on me, actually, the podcast, the Life Worlds, and then our back and forth by email, likewise. And not only that, that your influence has been the basis for my next book. So
No, I cannot claim any credit for that, but I appreciate that you've said it on the airwaves, so now everyone can get a sense that maybe something good is happening on this podcast. I'm also blushing because you're being very, very kind. And we are connected. I mean, the carbon that you wrote about is literally part and parcel of everything we are. You know, I think I knew about you before you knew about me. I think that's fair to say, because about 10 years ago, I was in one of these trendy Bay Area events, and you were up on stage and you were speaking, and it was one of the first things I'd ever heard of you. I hadn't read your books yet, and you were speaking about language and communications. And back then, I cannot iterate what a profound influence this had on the way that I conceptualized the issue, and the way I spoke about it, and the way that we speak obviously shapes our worldview. So you actually really shifted my worldview about how we talk about, you know, the planet, climate, et cetera, et cetera. And I really want to start us there. not just because it was so influential for me, but because language patterns how we think and how we see the world. So I think starting as two writers as well, I think starting speaking about language and words is a beautiful place to start. And so I kind of want to cue up this conversation on the dysfunctionalities that you speak to about the way that we use these languages. I'm going to pull out two lines. I love this line where you said, "Our science is extraordinary and our language is just horrible," and that most people's sort of climate language goes right over people's heads. Back then, I remember you were speaking about these war metaphors, right? Like we're fighting climate change. There's a battle. And just instinctively, I was like, he's right. This is creating duality. And to this day, some of the people I admire the most in the space still use this kind of retaliatory, very dualistic language. So please, can you bring us into that? And let's talk about how we rethink language. What's maybe the wrong way to talk about climate and nature and carbon? What's alienating, what's objectifying about it?
Yeah, it's a fascinating subject. I first became familiar with the science of climate change at Stanford Research Institute many decades ago. And the people who shared with me about it were a matter of fact. I mean, it wasn't, but at the same time, you had the sense that the realization of global warming, global heating was nascent in the sense of not the science, but that is the awareness and the concern. And so since that time, for many decades, I've watched the expression, I call it in a sense, not the expression, but I mean, the way science has tried to language is not a verb, but language the problem or the situation or the science or the threat. And what I saw was that science really sort of held on to it, and it was the progenitor of it, and found that its communication was ineffective, and it wasn't necessarily its fault. It's just that it didn't land, and there was a tendency then to amplify the message, amplify the adjectives even. And it wasn't long thereafter where it was picked up by non-governmental organizations, environmental organizations, who didn't have the restraint of science, if you will, and it could be much more vocal and declarative, really, about future existential threats, which was the key word bandied about. And then what I have seen is that wasn't very effective either in a mass sense. And it did reach a sort of a peak in the 70s with Jimmy Carter and so forth. There was a kind of a sense that people in America, I don't know about Europe, but were beginning to understand it. And President Carter went on TV with a cardigan, swear, and told everybody to turn the thermostat down, and it was like, okay. And solar panels were being talked about and put on the White House. But then after that, I felt like the language got more and more, actually got more male, speaking of gender. And the verbs were male verbs. They were sports and war verbs, and it's how men, I guess, were thinking about it or trying to make a sense of climate, what's happening to the climate. And so that came fight, and you still see it to this day. I saw it yesterday, in the news still uses, in reportage, the fight against climate change, the fight. Okay. But there was other word, like, I mean, the war, combating, tackling, sports metaphors. And so they really are particular to my gender, they're very male. And then the other one, which may not sound combative, but is about fixing. And that's a very male thing too. Men like to fix things, and I'm glad they do. I loved to fix things when I was a kid. I had motorcycles and this and that. I was a little grease monkey. But all those words, yes, exactly that, make climate, the atmosphere, the situation itself, and so forth, an object. In other words, it's an object that we have to do something to, or else. I mean, that was basically the grammatical construction, and of course that objectification, seeing it as separate, distinct, other, somewhere, is precisely the thinking that got us into this situation in the first place, because we've been othering the living world, other people, other cultures, other species. And I say we have to be very careful about that, because I think first person pronoun, plural, is a very dangerous pronoun to use, because who's we? But I would say we in the sense of the science that came out of the Enlightenment, Western Europe, and so forth. And for 500 years, the France and Belgium and UK, of course, and so forth, and the Germans, but Portugal, Spain, so forth, gone around the world and using the Vatican doctrine, of discovery, which says that if they landed on land, if they landed upon some place in the world, it was theirs. That was the Pope said so that must be true. And so, and then they could take whatever they wanted. And that included people, of course, the Atlantic Passage. They could take gold, silver, goods, people like, take people there, right there, and they could rape, they could pillage. Columbus's first appearance in the Dominican Republic was to actually cut off the heads of children, just cut with a sword, a single swipe of the sword, and then feed infants to their dogs. This is the first contact between Europe and the hundreds of indigenous cultures, in the Americas. And that sort of mindset of taking, of extracting, and so forth, has grown and multiplied, a million times over since then. And that is what informs our society, informs our goods, informs our economy, informs capitalism, and has made people incredibly wealthy. Not many of them, but enough of them to have control over our political levers of power. And so here we are fighting, tackling, combating, climate change. I'm going, it's the same mindset that fought and claimed and tackled the whole world wherever it could, not always in China, not easily in Japan, but, most of the Americas and much of Africa and Asia. And and that's the language we're employing to this day. Mm-hmm. And so the book, Carbon, the Book of Life, was meant to say, hang on, time out, wait. Is that really what we mean? Is that really who we are? Is that really going to work? It's not going to work. It hasn't worked at all, in my opinion. But more profoundly, it doesn't bring us together. It doesn't connect us together as people. And how could something of, that augurs the end of civilization as we know it in terms of a phenomena, that is to say, global heating, how could that after 50 years be basically largely ignored by over 99% of the people on Earth? That's a failure of communication of epic proportion.
So if we were to take some of those examples like fixing, fighting, or that, as you said, climate is an object that we do something to, how would you kind of Aikido the language? Like, what would you interject instead? What have you seen that, for all the people listening, they're like, gosh, I've used that. I've talked about saving the world as well. That's another one that's kind of interesting. So what's the more relational and nuanced kind of redirection you would give people instead of using language like fighting or fixing?
Well, first of all, I'd be really careful with the pronoun plural, the we. I really just, it's a default mode. I do it. Everybody does it. It's often done on compassion or care or concern, we. But as I mentioned that once to an indigenous person near the Atacama Desert in Chile, and they looked at me and said, "Who's we?"
Mm-hmm.
In other
Yeah.
words, it's who's we? You don't speak for me, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to learn. We have to learn not to use "we" as a pronoun when speaking about what besets us, all of us in the world, in terms of the heating of the atmosphere. But the language I think we need to use is relational language as opposed to objectifying language. And relational language is really the dynamic between you or a community or company or any entity that is any entity, whether it can be an individual or more than one individual, and other entities and its environment and what it does, and those words are very different. And so, what are the intentions of those words? They want to be restored. They want to be revitalized. They want to be regenerate. To bring life back is what we want, but we don't say it that way. We say it the other way, which is to kill or stop or combat something that is harming life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so forth. So that's sort of going backwards, really, because the cause of global heating is basically the destruction of the biosphere, and we destroy it two ways: one directly, and one indirectly, in the sense that we combust coal, gas, and oil, which are the remnants of the biosphere of swamp forests and marine organisms. And just as anecdotal, but I was on the 405, which is this ridiculous freeway in Los Angeles. Cars pour in every day. I think it's 16 lanes wide. I could be right. It could be 14. I'm not sure. There's so many lanes. And I had to stop for a second on the side of the freeway. And I was just then, when you're in the flow, you don't realize just the madness, the craziness of cars going both directions at 60 plus miles per hour. And so I did a calculation, and I realized that in terms of what's being combusted in 1 second, of all those cars going both ways on the 405 in Los Angeles, is the equivalent of a blue whale. Every second, a blue whale, a blue whale, a blue whale, a blue whale. In other words, the carbon and energy that's in a blue whale, we're just like that. And we don't see it that way. We see it, we're in our cars, you're quiet, we're listening to music, we're doing whatever we want to do. It's so beautifully designed and machined and engineered, that it insulates us from everything. But most importantly, we're insulated from actually our instantaneous and momentary and constant impact. And rather than villainize people for that so much, what I want to do is just can we raise our awareness of this relationship? We have a relationship with each other and with our place and with everything that occupies our place. There's 4 trillion creatures here. There are earthmates. They live here too. And we live and we're alive and we thrive because of them, not because of us. And not to say we don't do wonderful things and helpful things and productive things, but I'm just saying is that we are a family, and maybe if that now doesn't work for people, then there's other ones that do. But the fact is, we're intimately, intricately, complexly interconnected, and the fact that we don't see that makes it hard to have a relational language, or to see it as our relationships. And so that's really, I think the shift has to be about creating more life, because it's the absence and the destruction of life that is going to determine our future. And we have the data, we've seen the data points from 70% of loss of mammal life in the last 50 years, and 60 and 70% of pollinators have been or have disappeared. We don't know what happened to them, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so for us to focus on AI at this point is sort of like you've lost you've lost your purpose. To focus on going to Mars, like where there's no life, and then how, and to get there you have to destroy more life here. I mean, the ironies and the contradictions of the very fact that intelligence can be an artifice. Really, it can't. There's no such thing as artificial intelligence. But we are surrounded by brilliance and intelligence. That's the thing. And we haven't connected to it. We don't listen to it. We don't understand it. Because of our scientific way of understanding the living world.
I'm going to park for a second the conversation on whether, AI could be alive, or even, Mars itself is composed of all of these living atoms and processes. So in a way, Mars has life. It's just a different, Mars is life as well, right? And you speak about the cosmos in your book as being wildly alive. But I know what you mean by that. I really like the image on the freeway of the whales, and I think I was thinking a lot about like language and communication, and like what are some of the visuals, what are some of the things that once people see them, they're just undeniable and it makes it real. And that image of like whale, 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 it brings back that relationality to something we've sort of abstracted as matter, such as petrol. And it makes me think a lot about the language used in investment. So we just wrote our Naya Trust investment strategy note on language, and we really try and steer away from resource or asset inputs on the balance sheet. It's really tricky because in one sense, we have to build bridges to current systems. Otherwise, you're just going to be alienating and sort of, if you're just trying to be pragmatic, most of financial capital in the world is held by big institutional, sovereign wealth funds or pension funds. So you have to speak a language that suits them. At the same time, resources or assets doesn't do any justice to the relationality that we have with these, trees that are living beings, or these forests that itself is a living being. And so I'm really interested in, things like the climate space or the environmental movement and the investment space. Like, how do we talk about the living, like the biosphere, biodiversity, without abstracting it to a resource or asset type of language? That's been so hard. And it's a very tricky line to sort of tread. So I'll ping that there as maybe the last little note on language before I move us on to talk about carbon. But I've really been struggling. Another one that you clued me onto before I forget, can't remember if this was in the book or somewhere else, but it's not about decarbonization, which is like the term that everyone is using. But I love what you said, which is what you just referred to as well. Now we have to revitalize, we have to recarbonize, actually. That's a huge mind bend if you haven't heard it before, but it's deeply intuitive.
Yeah, we've been decarbonizing very well for the last, 200 years. Actually, longer when you start to look at wood and forests and agricultural practices that created basically deserts. And that happened more in the Mideast. It didn't happen in Asia. But yeah, the language that is innate to finance, to capitalism, is extractive. It is born from extraction, and you get, sell, and buy. And what are you getting? Well, you're getting something, and so forth. What's the value? Well, you monetize it. It's got to be a currency, some sort of currency, and then, double entry bookkeeping is really, really arose from, again, a sense of extraction. We never use that word in accounting or capitalism, but it's actually without which there is no economy as we know it. There is economies, by the way. I mean, but as we know it, practice it, and value it. And so, yeah, it must be very difficult for the Naya Trust to communicate in that way. I would give you an example, though, of, if I may, of a
Permission granted.
of a technology, which we can talk about more about technology later, perhaps, but technology invented or created by a group of people here, right nearby, actually, but the fact that it's nearby just is coincidental. And basically, it was invented by an Indian doctor at the University of Texas, and for medical diagnostics. And what it is a sensor. It's maybe 6 feet, if that, tall, and it goes into soil. It can be longer too, depending on the soil, but it goes into the soil, and it can measure in real time the soil organic matter, the soil inorganic carbon, soil organic carbon, moisture, bulk density, microbial life, etc. Okay, these are all signposts of soil health or ill health, or certainly things you need to know. Agriculture, however you want to date it, has never had real-time feedback or data on the soil. As I say in the book, when you stand on the roof, this is Jill Clapperton, that's not my quote, but when you stand on the ground, you're standing on the roof of another world. And so the agricultural world, and especially the chemical industrial ag world, has never provided real-time data. And what this does, the sensor, is that you can wake up in the morning, have your tea or coffee, and there is your soil. It's on your phone. You can see exactly what's going on in your soil on a daily basis, weekly, monthly basis. And so the reason that's so important is because no farmer wants to be a crappy farmer. They all want to be a better farmer. Well, better has been defined by more and more and more, but actually it hasn't been defined by actually a soil that can create more life, more nourishment, more nutrient density. It hasn't been defined that way. And so what this does is just doesn't change the soil. It changes the person who is relating to the soil. Because that farmer, whether it's a cacao farmer in Ghana or soy farmer in Nebraska or a coffee grower in Vietnam, around the world, I mean, if they have real-time feedback on the soil, now they add microbial life because the soil is a biome. We have a biome, and we talk about microbial life. Well, you can put microbes in the soil that are very inexpensive, that actually change what's going on down there. You can see right away that what you're doing is actually depleting soil life, that your organic matter is going down, that moisture is, the soil is getting desiccated, it's getting too compressed and compacted, the soil, bulk density. These are things farmers won't need to know. And if they know, they can act on it. And now they don't know, and the actions come from Bayer, Monsanto, Syngenta, Corteva, these big chemical companies, so here is a technology that actually reverses. It doesn't say to a farmer, "Oh, you should be a regenerative farmer. This is regenerative ag," or it's not saying, what you should do or what's right, even if that is right. The fact is, what it's doing is giving them the means and the tools to act in such a way that that will be the outcome. That's what they'll move towards because it works, not because it's the right thing to do. The right thing to do with soil is the thing that works the best. But it's just an example of it's relational now instead of extractive. It's not about cost, about buying. It's about, I would say regenerating, about generating the life that's innate to the soil and is always innate if we treat it properly. And this relationship between plants and roots and mycelia and bacteria and microbes and so forth is a generative process.
If I'm to link that example to some of the previous conversation, it's in a way, giving a voice to soil. Now, again, this is through a Western mind. I think in other worldviews, the soil is already speaking. We don't need a technological interpreter. These are, I think, some of the use cases of whether you want to call it tech or AI, or, there's obviously a little bit of AI used in a lot of the new ag tech tools. But, we've spoken about some of Karen Backer's work, bioacoustics, or I've had Martin Wikelski on the podcast speaking about the Internet of Animals and that sort of intimacy that we can develop via sensors that actually bring us closer to some of these voices of the living world that we've been distanced from actually just learning how to speak ourselves, I think is a huge, something I get quite excited by. And then if I'm to link that a little bit to carbon, because I do want to talk about your book. And I queued this up in the intro to the episode, but it is, a book told through the eyes of carbon. And you say, the flow of life is the flow of carbon. We have 1.2 trillion carbon molecules in every cell. And so it's a flow that animates everything we love, enjoy, all the plant life, all the sea life, everything that's life on the planet. Something you might not get asked on other podcasts because LifeWorld kind of asks, I ask like these weird questions. But I'm really curious, what was it like for you to embody the voice of carbon, like to have carbon speak through you? If you can remember some of the creative process, like what was it like to speak as carbon? Were there moments that were surprising for you? Were there moments when like you're like, wait, okay, that wants to be spoken. Interesting. Because in a way, in animacy, we embody the worldview of others to bring their voices into the world. And that's really what you did with this book. So can you speak about your very like personal experience in that?
Well, you're the first person to ask that question.
Shing, success.
I would say right away there was two things that happened. Obviously, I had to study it and read, and did so. And there's some great writers, great books on carbon. Eric Roston's book is one of them. Very inspiring to me. We know a lot about it, and I'll just say carbon as in it right now. So all that I took in, but not my knowledge, received knowledge. Okay. But then what fascinated me was two things. One is that we actually didn't know where carbon came from until relatively recently. And so I do write about that, how its origins were discovered. You say, well, what do you mean its origins? It's everywhere. Of course, we don't have to discover that. But I mean, in a cosmic sense, and the one-time sort of illusion that the Big Bang, created everything in a millisecond, and here we are, coalesced, due to gravity into, solar systems and galaxies and planets and the suns and all that sort of stuff. And I'm not saying that's not true, but what isn't true is that everything was created in a millisecond. It was just basically hydrogen and thereafter helium, alpha particles, as they're known. How did the rest of it come about? And that really, particularly carbon, because it's in 99% of the 33 million different substances on Earth. So it's ubiquitous, but there's a very small amount of carbon actually on the planet overall. And it was really Fred Hoyle, a UK astronomer, who in the 50s and 60s came up really with a proposal as to where carbon came from, because physicists could not figure out how carbon was literally created, even though it's on the table of elements, SC12, 6 neutrons, 6 protons, 6 electrons. And that sounds, well, yeah, I mean, you just take 3 helium, and the addition is perfect. 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4.
I like that you're giggling at like a very geeky chemistry math joke. I'm just like, you kind of like, I'll like pretend to giggle along, but I'm a bit lost with the That was good. I like the insider scientific chuckle. I'm very curious. Are you leading us to say that carbon told you how it was created? Is this the punchline?
No, it was Fred Hoyle. Fred Hoyle, the astronomer, who went to Caltech and said, this is the way it was created. It was created these giant red stars. Red stars are suns that are actually dying. And there is a moment in red stars only where two helium, I'll call them helium now, fuse for a billionth of a second, whatever that is. And in that time span, another helium particle, atom, of course, but I mean, combines and it makes carbon. And that's it. That's the only way carbon that we know and have here was created. And I mean, he was mocked. He went to Caltech, like physicists, Mecca. And he was laughed at and derided and scoffed and made fun of, really. And how could an astronomer possibly, understand the laws of physics and so forth? But anyway, he kept hectoring them. He was a very somewhat full of himself kind of guy, and said, "Hey, get a mass spectrometer and figure it out, and bomb nitrogen with electrons until you create C12, and you'll see." And they said, okay. And they did it, and they discovered, they affirmed that he was correct, which is stunning to them. And so they published a paper on it, and he was the lead author. And then Willie Fowler, who really led two other scientists to do this, were the co-authors. And then years later, a Nobel Prize was awarded for this science, and Hoyle was left out. He wasn't included in the Nobel Prize. And the reason he wasn't included was because after this was done, as a confirmed atheist who didn't have any of this God stuff in creation, he was like, I don't want any of that the universe doesn't have things like that going on, said that there's no way to explain this without understanding that there must be a higher intelligence beyond what we know as physics in the universe. Well, that disqualified him from the Nobel Prize and so forth. And so that, to your question, higher intelligence, like whatever that means to you or, to him or others and so forth. But it did intimate at something that is beyond the mechanical, physical, relationship, which is extraordinarily complex between atoms and muons and subatomic particles and all that sort of stuff in this carbon. And so to me, what happened is that I began to look at it as a flow. I stopped looking at it as a thing. And especially then looking at like what's in our cells, 1.2 trillion carbon atoms in a cell, a single cell, you can't even see it. And then it's sort of like opening up this vista of the ubiquity and pervasiveness of carbon, and the fact that it in chains can basically has memory and can store energy, and nothing else can do that. There is no salt, sodium, phosphorus, zinc, gold, silver. It doesn't matter. It's the only element that can do that. And so that's why it's called the basis of life. But to me, it just opened up worlds of exploration, I guess, of how life exists itself, how it expresses itself, how and I would say we are at ground zero in terms of our understanding of the flow of life. I really believe that. I think we don't understand. I don't think we understand what a human body is. I don't think we understand where we live, place. I can look out my window. I don't think we understand what's going on in the soil, which I call an organism. It's not a medium, et cetera, et cetera. So what came out of that was me saying, oh, what we don't know. And I found that more interesting and more fascinating as opposed to what we quote, quote, do know, which is Caltech and this and that and all that stuff about physics. But what we don't know is really how life works. And I know there's so many great scientists and people talking about it, and studying and publishing and being peer reviewed and all that sort of stuff. But I would say, reading the literature, I think we
Mm.
don't know it all. And that's kind of wondrous.
I love that. How are you going to engage that curiosity? Like when that's so peaked, like where does one go? I mean, you might just say literally outside in the forest to listen, but like, what do you do with that new wonder? And
Well, for me, in a very sort of minor way, I have to say minor, I don't kill any insects. Sorry, just can't. It's like the scorpions that come in, into my house, I gently put them in the jar,
mm-hmm.
the jar, and I walk them out. I don't want them in the house, it's not that painful to be bitten by a scorpion, but the whole thing of it is sort of loathsome. There's something about them, but I just don't. And I'd say the one exception is occasionally I will slap my cheek if there's a mosquito biting me. So I'm not a perfect person at all, but I'm just saying the reverence I have now, and you can get like an ultraviolet flashlight and go outside at night in your garden, or not in the city, but in a forest or someplace like that, and start flashing it around, and you'll see moths that you never ever see. And there's, they're the Lepidoptera family, same as butterflies. It's 170,000 different moths and 20,000 butterflies. There's more moths, and they're pollinators, they're pollinating at night. And I went out to my rosemary plant to get some rosemary, and it was covered with these tiny, tiny little moths, whose name I've forgotten, the Latin name, the binomial I've forgotten, but where'd they come from? And what are they doing there? And so I think it's more a thing of just like respect and, as I say, reverence, and rather than feeling a sense of knowledge. I actually have,
Yeah.
after exploring all that stuff, I feel like I know less than I thought I did. Yeah.
I mean, that's how transformation happens. It reminds me a lot Thomas Berry. I can't remember which one of his books. I can see the cover in my head because I was reading it in a sort of waterfall area behind Marin where I used to live. But he has this line about the evocation of mystique or mystery or awe, and that's kind of what you're speaking to. And he says, if we're ever to restore the purity of the rainfall, there must be a mystique of the rain. And I think that's what you're speaking to,
Mm.
right? It's like, and that's what's always really stunned me about your work. It's the way you tread the line between like science and poetry and the facts and the wonder, and even just what you describe now, like the fact that you're still deepening in your wonder, after this latest book. So how, like, for people that are working on these kinds of things, and who are listening, like, how do they strike the right balance between conveying the facts and the science and being rigorous, but then also having that evocation of the mystique, if I'll use that language from Thomas Berry. And just as a quick side note, it's really struck me that, your first book was about drawdown, and carbon was, in a sense, a noun in that book, right? It was really gigatons of carbon. And then you moved to regeneration. And I spoke about this in the introduction and to the episode, and that's a lot more dynamic and alive. But now you went a step further, and now it's like animate and spiritual. And so do you think that we can over-index in the science of the spirituality, or what's the right balance?
Well, the balance is determined by the person themselves and their pathway in life. I mean, and so I think that there's a lot of books around the psychology of climate, the mentality, the facts, about climate and the solutions. And there's a kind of tacit underlying narrative in those books, like, I know you don't listen up. Like, this is the way we should go, or if we don't do this, it won't happen. And, all these sort of implied or explicit beliefs of the author that he or she actually understands the deep underlying psychological underweavings that have created this mess we're in and all that sort of stuff. I'm not gainsaying any of those books so much, so forth at all, but I just say that no one knows what to do. Let's be honest, okay? There is no solution, quote, quote.
That's another word we have to strike.
Yeah.
Solution.
Yeah.
It's not a good word.
No, not at all. It's good for chemistry. The solutions are interesting.
Exactly.
It's like, but so I think and then the exigency of that, makes people want, reach for something, grab something, hold on to something, identify with something, a group, a concept, a book, a teacher, a leader, a technology, or several at the same time. And again, I'm not trying to gainsay any of that. I'm just trying to say, if you step back and say, well, where are you now? Where are you in your life? And we know that if you don't feel you have a direction or guidance, well, that's understandable. But I feel like when you step back into yourself and so forth, there's wisdom there. There is something really beautiful in all of us, and I think it can be measured by grief because we tend to think we don't want to grieve in a way, but we feel it. And I say it's the other way around. Grief is your ally. And the reason it's your ally is because you don't grieve for something unless you have love. If you don't love something, I mean, what's grief for? The grief doesn't arise, and so forth. And we do love. People love lots of things about their lives, and they don't see any connection with that to these meta, issues of climate and global heating and all the impacts it's having. But love can only come from one place. It comes from the heart, and that's the organ that tells you the truth always. It will, from the day you're born to the day you die and afterwards. And so that is really, that's the origin. That's the space, from whence you will know what to do. And it's really, I mean, Alexa, I think about maybe the analogy, and I don't know if we spoke, I wrote to you about this, but about fire. And we have a lot of fires here in California, always had, by the way, and now they're worse because of the way we don't manage our forests and our brush. When the 56 different tribes were here in California, lived here, they practice fire ecology in most cases because to create more food and to create less danger. And so when I was a lad, I lived in the Sierras and we had fires. And we didn't have a lot of firemen, couldn't afford it, and so when there was a fire, then there was volunteers, of course, and they would teach you what to do and what kind of boots to wear with the metal and the heels and the soles. I mean, all that sort of stuff. But that experience was interesting for me because, then after it's out, it's not. You have to tamp it down with his metal-soled shoes to make sure there's not manzanita embers underneath that are red hot, by the way, and will start a fire again if the wind kicks up. And you do that, and finally, no fire. Well, you're black, covered with carbon dust, and you go wash and this and that, and you're happy it's done, and so forth. But what happens then? And what happens is spring. And in the spring, the grass that comes up after a fire is extraordinarily different in color because of all the minerals that have been deposited there on the soil from the ash. And not only that, you get, it's called fire-triggered succession. Forgive the term, it's not, but basically you see wildflowers. You see wildflowers you hadn't seen, or you had never seen, but hadn't been seen there for 50, 60, 70, 100 years. In other words, where'd they come from? Well, they came from seeds in the ground. But seeds that were basically the carapace, the cover of the seed, needs extreme heat to break it open. And so I would say that the seeds are here. What's happening with humanity around the globe is extraordinary. And you don't hear about it because it's a single wildflower, or it's in this ridge, or it's just an NGO. It's in Botswana. It's here. It's down there in Australia, in the Northern Territory. It's, in a farm up in Washington State. It's something that happens. These things are happening all over the world where communities are getting together. It can be a community, it can be a family. It can be beyond that as well, and so forth, are figuring out how to stay there, how to be there, how to live there in such a way that actually creates more life. And that's happening all over. And we don't hear about it. We don't read about it. Occasionally, maybe you and I will, and maybe all the listeners as well, because that's our nature and that's our predilection. But in fact, it never makes the news cycle, ever, because it doesn't light up the amygdala. It's not a click through. It's considered to be too small to be relevant because the big things are happening, are political and economic and corporate, or sports, and so we don't know about it. But that is happening. So in this case, the analogy of the fire and fire triggered succession, which actually takes time, is happening simultaneously. Which is the fire is burning, and it's burning up our. I need to fill in that sentence. The fire of destruction and damage that's happening within the world, to the environment, to people, to cultures, to migrants, to transgender people. The fire is here. Okay. So we know that, and we read about it. We wake up in the morning, open the paper, there's what I'm calling the fire. We don't understand that actually we are a species and we are brilliant, not in the way that's popularly considered, but we're brilliant in the sense that we have this deep intuitive understanding that our role here in our short time that we exist and so forth is to create more life. Mm-hmm. And that's happening. Yeah.
You speak about this in your book, Blessed Unrest, right? And all of these movements. There's something like very strange. I don't know why I trust that and other people don't. Like, I have an inherent trust in what you've just described, that there are billions of points of light, and that all of these collective movements, and so many people speak about it so well, right? But that there are all of these points of light, like Rebecca Solnit in Hope in the Dark, and then we just don't know how change happens. But I have such a deep trust in that, and I know many people that can be quite alien to other people, and so it's nothing to discuss now to solve, but just to say, it's interesting to me how one can trust that process, and sometimes from the outside it can seem inscrutable, and maybe that's just because I'm in that space every day. I really feel all of those points of light. I want to go back to what you said around heat and grief. I'm currently taking Francis Weller's course on sort of grief tending and the 5 gates of grief. It's beautiful, very very elegant work. And he talks about we have to keep grief warm, and we have to keep its intensity and keep it moving. And so I really like that you made that analogy between the fires and the grief, and the sort of mythopoeticism of how those are related. And he says something that I really appreciate, which is we have to become transparent to the transcendent. Like, we have to become ourselves such worthy vessels of that transcendent, whatever it may be, the love, the grief, in order to channel work well. And so I like how you answered the question before around, is it science, is it poetry? And your answer was like, it's whatever you are, right? Like, you have to become transparent, I think, to whatever you are, and not be so calculated about it. I know that we don't have a ton of time left, and there's 2 more things I want to get to. And as we're veering into that space, let's just go there. This notion of spirituality, right, which is kind of even the language I started using there. It's not like the technical fixes can happen, but you've also spoken to this, right, that we need a spiritual revolution. And so I'm curious, when you look at the world today, like, how can people participate in that deeper enlivening of their souls, right? That firing up of their spirits. Like, are there certain practices or rituals you think people should bring back, or like people might be thinking like, this sounds great, but like, where do I turn to? How do I do this? How do I do this thing? And maybe even there's things you participate in yourself that you'd want to share.
Yeah, I mean, I am not prescriptive in any way. I don't give advice to people. I'm the same as anybody else, which is to, trying to figure out who I am, what I want to do. And especially when you get older, the dimensionality of it changes in terms of, you're gonna leave soon. So, what has meaning, what doesn't, it changes, over the span of one's lifetime, or it normally does anyway. And so, but I would say that you said something there about, I forget what the sense was. It cut out for a minute, but so I didn't get it all. But I don't know what we need to do. I really don't, because I see humanity as one of the 8.7 million species, okay, on Earth, and that are that developed this incredible brain that we have, this extraordinary brain, and we did so by mastery of fire and cooking, and that changed our nervous system, but that doesn't exempt us from being one of the other 8.7, I call Earthmate, 8.7 million Earthmates that were here. And I think there's what we've done and what we're doing to ourselves, I think there is going to be is arising a tendency. Can I come home? Because for a lot of people now, this doesn't feel like home. And people want to go home. And we have fairy tales about children getting lost, and finding their way home, and so we are those children. And coming home means coming home, to like Weller's, teachings that you're talking about. And what arises from that is going to be distinct in every person, and different, and not sort of prescriptive or even similar necessarily. It's a direction, and it's a pathway, and it's a pathway of meaning, though, and that's the most important thing, because I think what's lost in the exponential increase in technology and all the inputs, and we have less and less time to do less and less, really, but we think more and more. All that's lost is ourselves. We get lost in that. And so I think I have a profound faith that as a species that's connected to all the others, we will renew, restore, and will we do it in time? I don't know what in time is, will it be 8.3 billion people? Probably not. Will it happen in our lifetime? Not mine. Certainly. But I do have this deep, deep faith in in life itself, and in all its manifestations. So I really appreciate your understanding the book and your questions too, because I feel like you're getting underneath, not underneath, but underneath in the sense of like if you raise your hands like this, you're holding something like so you hold something in a prayer. You hold something between your hands, and I feel like it is a prayer. What I'm trying to do is a prayer to what we hold sacred and what we know is sacred. And the fact that it's been glossed over and we've forgotten it, or we've been drugged over, whatever. That's a tragedy, but it doesn't mean we don't know. And I feel like we do know. We really
Yeah.
do. And we've lost meaning, and that's a terrible thing, to have no meaning in one's life, and people act that out, and that's probably the greatest lack we have on earth is not food, energy, water, and so forth. It's actually purpose and meaning, and that's what this offers. It offers purpose and meaning, and that gives people so much that they're missing.
Well, I'd say yes, the book reads as a prayer. I think what the book offers is participation. It's like a reminder to the fact that even when we don't know it, and even when we forget about it, we are always participating with absolutely everything, right? And I think that is a big gift of the book. It shows, and a lot of your other work, not just the book. I mean, it shows that we are participating in a world that is alive and exquisite on so many multiple levels, and both all of the different ways of knowing, the science, the poetry, like it all brings us. I love what you said. I got shivers before. Like it all brings us back home, and it so profoundly does. And that it's a gift, and I can imagine that your neighbors definitely do love the book. I can't imagine who wouldn't. As a closing question, because on Life Worlds we always take the perspective of the other beings. So you're going to be Carbon, if you may, and Carbon is this great flow, this great connector, this diplomat, if you will, between all the life forms, sort of like saying, "Hey, squirrel, here's a nut." What would you want to say? What would Carbon want to say? Right, not you, Paul. What would Carbon want to say right now to sort of close out this conversation? What would be the words that this Homo sapiens body, you, is speaking as Carbon?
I would probably say Carbon would say it would use the first person. Okay,
Good
I,
start. Good start.
I Carbon recommend things. Be very, very still and dance.
Ooh, that's very good.
Yeah,
It's got like a roomy Sufi lilt to it. That
yeah,
does.
true. Yeah.
Paul, anything else you want to say before we close out this part of the conversation?
I want to just say how grateful I am to you and what you do and what your life's about. And you're exemplary of what I've been referring to overall in terms of humanity. But the change happens in such mysterious ways. I mean, we sometimes look back and say, "Oh, this is what caused change," but actually, in real time, we don't understand change and the dynamics of it. And I feel like there's nodes or touchstones or places where you just, I'll say I feel just a sense of joy, of gladness, of happiness, of yes, and I have a big loop here. I walk. It's a 4 mile loop through the forest and trees, and there's some houses and so forth. And when I'm walking the loop, you're in my ear, and AirPods, my phone, your podcast, and that's the feeling I have when I listen to it. And so I just want to say thank you for your life's purpose and what you are doing with your life. And it gives me faith and uh, and joy. It actually gives me joy. Yeah. So thank you.
Oh, I'm squirming. These things always make me quite awkward.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Obviously, the prayer is, may we all just be that for each other. I think we always remind each other constantly what we are. So now when I speak, I'll also be thinking about you walking your forest loop, and it'll give me extra motivation to record things on maybe a more, sad or lonely day.
Yeah.
Paul, it's been such a joy to have you on, and I'm sure it won't be the last time we'll have you on Life Worlds. But just thank you so much for everything you're doing. I mean, you're inspiring millions of people with your books. Like I would, it's something I would aspire to in my lifetime, is to touch a fraction of the people you've touched. So deeply grateful for everything you do.
Thank you so much. Thank
Yeah.
you, Alexa.
So, my friends, as carbon through the voice of Paul today, and I guess through me speaking right now, as carbon reminds us, let's be very, very still and dance. The fire is here, and so are the seeds. I actually want to end this episode with a poem that was shared with me recently called Love in a Time of Climate Change by Craig Santos Perez. I've never closed an episode with a poem before, surprisingly, but this feels quite apt. So here is this poem, and I will see you next time on Life Worlds, where we will be delving into the fertile ground of grief, which feels very appropriate to follow some of the conversations today. Here's the poem. I don't love you as if you were rare earth metals, conflict diamonds, or reserves of crude oil that cause war. I love you as one loves the most vulnerable species, urgently, between the habitat and its loss. I love you as one loves the last seed saved within a vault, gestating the heritage of our roots. And thanks to your body, the taste that ripens from its fruit still lives sweetly on my tongue. I love you without knowing how or when this world will end. I love you organically, without pesticides. I love you like this because we'll only survive in the nitrogen-rich compost of our embrace. So close that your emissions of carbon are mine. So close that your sea rises with my heat. That was Love in a Time of Climate Change by Craig Santos Perez. Thank you very much.